If two railway lines cross each other, or if a railway comes across a major destination, you expect a station. And the same should be true for junctions where railway lines split apart. The places where two or more lines come together are natural transit hubs, critical network nodes, and among the most important stations in any city. Right up there with shoulder stations and major metro-metro interchanges. In fact, junction stations are often among the most important in an entire country. So in today's video, let's look at some major junction stations, how such stations should be designed and planned, and why getting the service right at these critical network interchanges is so important. Hey, I'm Reese and this is RM Transit, a channel about different types of stations and why I love all of them equally. Some of the most important railway stations in the world are junctions. From Clapham Junction in London to Shinagawa in Tokyo and Ostkreuz in Berlin. And while it might sound obvious, I think it's worth highlighting what a junction station actually is. A junction station is naturally one which is near a junction, often before the tracks for two or more train lines split apart. Clapham Junction, for example, is relatively unique because the station is directly on top of the junction. The tracks have sort of already started to split apart at that junction station, and so the platforms are located in two separate groups on the two diverging lines. This design can be great because it places the station right at the junction, but it does also have its downfalls. For example, transferring between platform groups can sometimes be a bit of a hike, and platforms are also often curved. I mentioned earlier that junctions form natural transit hubs, and that's true in the same way that a cross interchange between two subway lines is also a natural transit hub. In both cases, the enormous transit capacity provided by having two lines and multiple different services intersect enables massive ridership and requires careful thought. A major junction station allows transfers between various services headed out to the different branches from the junction. And if there's some level of local and express services on the line as it's approaching a junction, the junction becomes the natural place to terminate that service pattern. Since by having all services, including express trains, stop there, you naturally bookend that portion of a corridor with local and express service. That way, there's an express service accessible to anyone traveling along the branches from the first location where that's conceivably possible, which is at the junction. If you have a rail corridor with local and express service where a junction station isn't served because it would add travel time, it's usually worth dropping another station where express trains do stop and replacing it with the junction. That's not only because junction stations tend to be important and offer lots of connections, but trains are also often traveling fairly slowly around junctions due to all of the curves and switches that frequently exist at them. Of course, having all trains stop only further enhances capacity and connectivity. It's worth highlighting that in any case, transit services only provide capacity and connectivity when they actually stop. Just because a particular corridor has tons of service running on it doesn't actually mean that corridor is super accessible. You need the stops to provide that interface between the train service and actual passengers. You also actually need service patterns that make trains call at that station and platforms that align with the tracks the trains are running on to actually get passengers onto trains. Not having trains stop at a junction can also be super impactful for trips between the branches united at a junction station. Since having to ride further down the line and then backtrack wastes time, energy, capacity, and frankly is just unpleasant as a passenger. People don't like the idea of backtracking, even if it means a faster trip overall. Human psychology plays a big role in transit and how riders feel about it, and you'd be surprised how often people want a feeling of progress and consistency more than speed. Of course, speed also is incredibly important. As it turns out, the design of the junction can also have huge implications for the passenger experience. For example, on two-track lines, such as many subway and light rail lines, having a junction station, which is just a single island platform, is often ideal because passengers can actually make a cross-platform transfer between the different branches. Even if they need to change services on the same platform, they won't have to go up and over to catch a different train. You can see an example of this at Bridgeport Station in Vancouver. And in fact, on a four-track line, having two island platforms also enables cross-platform transfers, but in this case between inbound and outbound services, like at a location such as Chatswood in Sydney. Sometimes, even if the main line is only 2 or sometimes 3 tracks, a junction will still have 4. extending the tracks from both of the branches right into the junction station itself, which is something you can see at some stations in Singapore, at some U-Bahn stations in Germany, and at MacArthur in Oakland on the BART system. On one hand, having extra tracks at a station doesn't let you push more trains through the line for the most part, but it can give you a lot of flexibility and nice to have features, like being able to run one branch as a shuttle without interfering with operations on the other branch, or to even enable timed transfers between outbound services, which can stop at either side of an island platform, allow passengers to interchange, and then continue on to their respective branches. Now, much of what I've talked about with junctions has been relatively straightforward, but I want to get a bit theoretical here. When I was completing my computer science degree, I did a ton of work with graphs and networks. And a lot of the intuitive thinking I developed doing that work influences how I think about networks and junctions today. You can look at a rail network like a series of pipes, with larger pipes being rail lines with higher capacity, and with junctions being interconnections that allows flow from one pipe to the next. And when you look at things this way, it makes the importance of junctions all the more obvious. For one, if you consider a junction station located some distance from the actual junction, flows between the outer two branches which come together at the junction needlessly take up capacity on the main line headed towards the city center. That eats up valuable capacity which need not be wasted if the junction was placed at the junction itself. Something similar happens when local and express services do not all stop at a junction. This disconnection effectively forces the network to split earlier than the actual junction, specifically at the last station where both service types stop. That means capacity falls off more quickly than it needs to. If the local and express pipes connect at a junction station, you allow an interconnection between these two different services. That allows people traveling from either branch to immediately switch to the service type they want to continue along, local or express, saving capacity downstream, including at the interchange stations. In some ways, you can look at a junction station as a pipe itself, with larger pipes corresponding to larger station capacities. Such station pipes are the interconnection points between various services. If the station doesn't have enough capacity, the flow traveling from one line to another is limited. This is also a critical justification for junction stations. Since junctions typically face into the suburbs, where land is cheaper and more lines exist, they naturally form the furthest point from the city center where two services can come together. That means that the cost of building a large transfer station where people can get from one service to another is often cheapest at the junction, where land values are likely the lowest compared to the city center. For that reason, it's often advantageous to have people make line-to-line transfers between local and express services right at a junction, as opposed to busy and expensive to upgrade city center stations. Splitting the pipes earlier than necessary not only has impacts on passengers traveling in and out of the city, but also between the branches. When you look at things from a network structure perspective, a junction station far from the actual junction and local and express services which don't both stop effectively mean the same thing. You're creating extra wasted distance and capacity between the junction itself and the actual junction interchange point. That can have huge impacts on the attractiveness of suburban branch-to-branch journeys, or even on capacity on your network, since if passengers have to ride into the city and then back out to interchange between branches, that capacity heading to the city center can't be used by other passengers. Now, speaking of those suburb-to-suburb journeys between branches, how likely are they? Well, as it turns out, junctions get more and more powerful the greater the spread of their branches. A junction station where two lines split but run roughly parallel and close together is a lot less valuable than one where the two branches head off in opposite directions. That's because the more the branches diverge, the more competitive they become with a direct trip between them. A great example of this is Scarborough Station in Toronto, a station which isn't currently planned as a junction station, but which would serve the role perfectly, since it connects two lines which are already quite far apart for most of their length, allowing direct trips between two important Toronto suburbs. This is your regular reminder that we should definitely fix this and build Scarborough Station for interchanges. Of course, if everything in this video has seemed a little bit simple, the reality is things get much more complicated in the real world. For example, the high level of transit service and natural transit hub status of junction stations mean they often become stops on other perpendicular transit lines. They're also often much more complex, with more than two outbound branches and sometimes more than one rail line feeding them. For example, Clapham Junction in London is fed by several different rail lines and splits out to form much of the South Western Railway network in the UK. What's certain is that junction stations are a fundamental element of any train system, and getting them right is critical. Thanks for watching. you.